This is Art364 Part 4, Italian Renaissance, uh, Sculpture and Architecture of the 1400s. The Renaissance began in Florence, and this is a bird's eye image of the center of Florence with the cathedral with its large dome, the Campanile by Giotto, the bell tower, and the baptistry, which was an ancient building, and the Palazzo Vecchio back there. The streets here, this street and the cross street, are the original cross streets of the Roman cities that was founded during the Roman times. Uh, in the 1300s, the Renaissance sort of began. We call that the Proto-Renaissance. Began as a literary resurrection of classical literature. It also the three main literary characters of Petrarch, Boccaccio, and Dante began writing in the vernacular, sort of bringing a kind of a civic pride for the culture of Italy, and Giotto changing the type of paintings from the Middle Ages, where things were more symbolic, spiritual looking, abstract, and to a large extent, to images where things were much more realistic, or at least uh, uh, more human looking. But here in the what we call the Renaissance proper, right around 1400, they'd had a century since Giotto, and in half a century since the plague, the Black Death, had killed uh, a large percentage of the population, and 50 years of recovery for that, and now in 1400s the business was booming, the town was growing, the people were much more prosperous, it had become a republic, and it was run by a small number of families who were the leaders of guilds, and they were running the place, as a large commercial enterprise, and because many people were getting rich, there was building programs and lots of patronage for new works. The cathedral at the time, around 1400, was completed for most of the lower level all the way around. I think this part was finished, but they still had the dome and the drum that were not yet made. The San Giovanni, the baptistry here, it had bronze doors on the south side made by Pisano. Here's a sample of what they looked like. This had been done prior, about 100 years before, and these were nice, and it was a big program to do that then. But now they wanted to do a new program and do the north doors. Back in the early 1300s, Pisano had made these such that they still have a lot of medieval quality, Stilton, little doll-like figures, and drapery and all that, and the little rocks. You recognize these as the kind of things that come from that time. But still, even the figure of Christ still looks a little like this beginning moving in the direction of natural proportions, or at least classical proportions. But around 1400, when they were going to do the north doors, they decided to do a competition. I guess there had not been any masters in metalwork who were aged and could be just given the competition, given the commission, because many people had died during the plague, and now there was just a bunch of young guys coming up, and I think they had 6 or 7, and many of those were became major players, major sculptors in the Renaissance. But we have 2 of the competition panels that are interesting, and they're illustrative of a certain the attitude that occurred right at that time, and which was going to sort of move the Renaissance in the direction that it took by who they chose as the winner of the competition. The one on the left is by Brunelleschi. The one on the right is by Ghiberti. The competition stipulated that the work had to be in bronze, cast in bronze, and it had to have a certain, the story is the same story. It's the sacrifice of Isaac with Abraham. the moment when Abraham is just about to sacrifice Isaac, who's on an altar here and on a mountaintop, and an angel stays his hand. You see both of them, angel there, angel here, and they also have to have the ram, which was the substitute sacrifice. Um, there's the ram up here in Ghiberti's version, and also had to have a horse or mule or donkey, or whatever kind of animal this is, and a couple of figures down at the bottom here, who are the servants down on this side. So they have the same elements almost exactly. And they were, they needed to show off that they could, you know, cast something in bronze, that they could model it, that they could, the artistic quality and all that. But when these were both really good, and either of them could have gotten the commission. As it turned out, Ghiberti was the one who won, and it's what's instructive about it is that there's certain properties that this work has that's going to lead to what the Renaissance was to become, whereas Ghiberti, has other properties that look actually more like it belongs in the previous era. So the Ghiberti was sort of looking forward, or at least what eventually transpired is more consistent with his work. But not to worry, Brunelleschi had a wonderful career afterwards, and rose way above Ghiberti as a result. But let's look at the style of these two. If you look at Brunelleschi's, it's very dynamic. The figure of Abraham is leaning this way to create this tension between him and the angel, stopping him. He's physically holding him and stopping him from going forward. The figure of Isaac is naturalistic, and it's kind of skinny and wiry, and is in an awkward pose. And there's a lot of the zigzag of his legs create a kind of a tension between this thrusting forward here, these legs bent, are all kind of creating lots of tension right here, because it's his intent was to make it to create a lot of drama between what's going on right here. Especially, it was the whole intention of picking this moment in the story is because this is the greatest amount of drama in the story. This angle here is repeated in the horse's neck here, and the turbulence that's caused by this is sort of turbulence goes into the neck of the sheep there. The motion here of the angel moves this way and also continues out into this fluttering breeze of the cloth behind Abraham's head. So all of this, it's kind of naturalistic in the senses, it's like what it would actually look like if there's the boy seems to struggle. The father has to hold him by the neck, the way you would for an animal in a sacrifice. This is, it's not ideal. That is, it's natural. It's sort of the way, if you wanted to depict it closer to the way it actually happened in one's imagination, you do it this way. Whereas Ghiberti, he cleans it up to a certain amount. He has the figure of Isaac, instead of struggling, it's like an idealized classical sculpture. The proportions look classical. The way it sort of bulges out. Look at the pectorals and the deltoid muscles here, all sort of bulging out the way the spear bearer did in the Greek sculpture, or many classical sculptures. The proportions of the figures all look. It even looks kind of like contrapposto. It looks ideal, and this is completely different from Brunelleschi's version, which looks kind of more like a real boy, and he seems to be struggling. Isaac here on this side doesn't look like he's struggling. The motion of the father is also has a nice graceful sway to it, and that sway is picked up in the rocks here, making amplifying that graceful move this way. It's the rearing back of the hand or the arm, the elbow coming back in a little fluttering breeze right there. that is creating the motion. And the angel coming in is not stopping it. He's just stopping it, I guess, with his word, with his presence. But it doesn't have that thrust forward. It just has the rearing back, and that gracefulness and the idealism of the figure is more in line with something that is classical, as opposed to something that is much more naturalistic or realistic and um, with the tension and everything. So that in itself is an indication of perhaps why they picked this, because the spirit of the times was to bring back things that came from classical antiquity. This one has the altar that he's on, this with his little ronceau pattern. This is a canthus sort of pattern on it. This comes directly from Roman sarcophagi, so it's something that people recognize. Oh, this is a Roman thing, this is a Roman thing, or a classical thing, and this grace of everything looks idealistic, which is a characteristic of classical things. Brunelleschi tried. He put a classical sculpture here. This boy sitting down, pulling a thorn out of his foot. You can kind of see a little bit. He's holding his foot in his hand. And he's reaching out. This is a classical sculpture. People would recognize that pose from something that existed that was found. I think it was a Roman sculpture, or maybe it was Greek Hellenistic or something. But that's that little touch doesn't lend a whole lot of classicism to this. This has a kind of a Gothic feel to it, especially that the drapery, this strong drapery thing. It kind of looks like the Klaus Schluter from the north, that kind of drapery, the international style. Whereas this, is graceful, and that in itself apparently was enough to win Ghiberti the competition. This is what it looks like, kind of cleaned up. You can see it was originally gilt, and that some of the gilding has come off. They've taken the originals and put them in the museum now, and they don't. These were never outside, like the ones that actually became the ones for the doors. There's that. You see a better look at that Roman pattern here of the altar. So that's the competition, and Ghiberti won, and Ghiberti got the commission, and he did the north doors, and it took them many years, and his studio taught many artists how to do sculpture, and many of the famous artists from the 1400s came out of that studio. And when he finished, he was given the commission for the east doors, which we're going to see shortly, and he didn't have to do a competition for that. And he took a lot of years to do that, and it essentially took up his whole life doing these doors, the north doors and the east doors. He didn't have time to do hardly anything else. Whereas Brunelleschi, once he lost this competition, he went to Rome and did all sorts of wonderful things. We're going to see that it was better for him that he lost the competition. So the thing that Brunelleschi's done, he does two great things. One is that let's say three great things. He designed the dome. This is Brunelleschi's dome. He also, in the process of doing research to make the dome, he invented linear perspective, which is going to be influential to all of the artists from then on, as is this dome going to be influential to architecture from then on. And as well, he designed a bunch of architectural buildings. We'll see those, and those will be influential from then on. So he's one of the most influential architects that ever lived, I think, at least until we get to Palladio. So here's the deal with the dome. In the late 1200s, when they first laid out the plan of this church, it was huge, gigantic church, sort of shaped like a cross with these truncated arms here and the apse over here. But they left room, a span. It was so huge that they didn't have the technology at the time to cover it. They had this notion they were going to put a dome here, but nobody had made a dome since the Romans, and that was many centuries in the past, and over 1,000 years, and no one had made anything like that, and they didn't know how the Romans did it when they did make it, and yet they just made this plan on the faith that eventually someone would come along who could do it. Well, he did, and it was Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi went after his competition loss, went to Rome, and he studied the Roman architecture there and the ruins like the Pantheon and the Roman Forum and any other, the Colosseum, anything else that he could find. And he understood how the Romans made things. And the process of studying the Roman ruins, they're in pieces on the ground. And one of the things that he did in order to uh, diagram what a building was going to look like, or what it had looked like when it was new, was to make drawings. And in those drawings, he had to sort of, as like an archaeologist, figure out where everything is. And the way he would do that would be he would take this a rod and stick it in the ground and make it perfectly plumb. And on the top of the rod would be a disc, and the disc would have the degrees written around it, and the 360 degrees around it. And he would take a string and tie it to the top of the pole, and uh, uh, have that string stretch out to some point that he wanted to measure. And he would measure the angle it is from that pole and the distance from the pole. So we'd have angle and distance uh, for everything that he would that he would measure. And so using that, uh, as a way to record the positions of everything, he was able to come up with an idea. He says, you can make pictures this way. That is, if you assume that a picture is made from a single point and measure everything to that point, its distance and its angle, then you can have pictures that are consistent, and you can create the illusion exactly the way the eye sees, the way complex forms. And he did this in a demonstration. He made a painting, a couple of paintings that had a peculiar way of looking at the paintings. He chose actually this spot, like just inside the doorway of the cathedral, looking at the baptistry, and he made a drawing or a painting of what this would look like in a small, like a cubit wide picture, and he faced it towards you, but had a mirror between you and it. Actually, it's the other way around. The back of the painting is to you, and the mirror is on the other side. And you look at the mirror, you look at the picture through a hole, and through that hole, you would see the picture in the mirror. And you can move the mirror out of the way and see the baptistry through the hole. And when you put the mirror there, you would see exactly the same thing that you would see uh, as you would see without the mirror. So the painting was exactly the same as as what you would actually see from that point of view. He also did another one over here for the Palazzo Vecchio. One was a 2-point perspective, and the other was a 1-point perspective. But they represented the what could theoretically be done. And when we get to the painting portion of the Italian Renaissance, we will see examples of how that was used. By he knew all the painters, and he taught them how to do it. Then when he came back, he had to enter another competition to do the dome, and when he won that, he he did this dome. Let's take a little look here at the inside. He came up with the idea, which was not a Roman idea. He'd seen the Pantheon is not done this way, though the Pantheon's dome is almost exactly the same size. I think it's 143 feet, and this is 139 feet in span. But it's a double dome. It's two shells, an outer shell and an inner shell. And the inner shell has these ribs in it, and it's also on an octagon rather than a circle. And it's also pointed. Instead of being a hemisphere like the Pantheon, it's got a it's it goes up as a pointed arch, and has a lantern on top of it, unlike the Pantheon. So it's whatever he learned by studying the Pantheon. It was not applied here. He invented these things. No one else had made a double dome. You can see the inner and the outer part here, and there's space between the two, which with a spiral staircase going all the way to the top to the dome, and you can actually visit it if you see. Let's see. I think I have a picture. You can see people? Nope. Maybe this one. Yeah, you can see people there. There are people up here. You can see kind of low resolution, but you can see that there's people, and you can see the scale of the thing. It's an enormous object floating up in the air, and it dominates the whole skyline of Florence. So he invented this scheme of making a dome, and virtually all the domes that you've seen, St. Peter's and St. Paul's and the Capitol Dome in Washington, are all have the same sort of features to them. And he resolved that engineering problem, as well as the problems of how to make it without scaffolding. He made it so that you could essentially the masons could put a course of masonry each course without having to have a whole forest full of scaffolding to hold the thing up, and that was an engineering marvel itself, to be able to make the thing so that you could, each time it made a course of masonry, that course of masonry would lock itself in and wouldn't fall, and he goes up that way. He also designed the winches to bring things up, to bring heavy materials up to the top, and also to bring the workers up to the top and to bring them down so that they could go up and come down during lunch and stuff without being tired of walking upstairs or climbing ladders and stuff. So he thought it all through and did lots of marvelous things, and perspective itself was a marvelous thing as well, and we'll get to see that. But let's look at his architecture apart from the dome. This is San Lorenzo, and it's just to show you what other things he did. He made a church here. Let's see. This is the ground plan of the church. He designed it this way, with this much more rectilinear, I guess you could say, than compared to Gothic churches from the past. With square modules going on the side. This is the nave and the side aisles. And you can see the way those square modules make. You can see on the floor, these are the squares. And each square bay has its own vaulting. And the vaulting, instead of being Gothic vaulting with ribs and pointed arches and stuff, they're hemispheres. As if you had taken a cube, a solid cube, and erased out of it a spherical shape to leave this shape is the negative shape up there. He also has this penchant for dark stone contrasted with white walls, and the darker gray stone makes the arcade and the columns. And the columns, are true Roman-looking columns. I mean, most of the things that were made in the Middle Ages that had columns, that were Roman columns, were actually stolen from real Roman buildings and made into churches. But these were carved for this. And this little thing here that extends the height of the archway, called an impost block, I think, is sort of an abbreviated version of an architrave, which, if this had been an actual Roman building, there would be an architrave right here rather than an arcade. I don't think the Romans ever did this. And this was his own invention. I don't think the Romans ever did the thing with the two different color stone and white against one another. This was his own invention. In fact, these pilasters like this with the arches underneath it, this is also his own invention. So when he went to Rome and studied Roman architecture, it's not like he copied it and came back and made Roman architecture. He invented a new architecture using kind of like the language of Roman stuff, because he wanted to be his rather than just simply a copy of things from Rome. And he wanted to surpass it. During the Renaissance, not only for architecture, but for painting and sculpture, is that the highest compliment an artist could receive was that he surpassed the Romans. everybody wanted to do things that would bring back Roman things, but they didn't want to just copy. They wanted to surpass it. So this is how he did that with his own look and his own style. And this is going to be hugely influential for all the other architects that are done. In fact, the painters as well. When we see painting, we'll see paintings where they include this in their paintings as what the New World looks like. But the thing on our list that we're by him that we have as representative of his is this the Ospedale. It's called the Hospital of the Innocents. It's an orphanage, and it has this arcade out front. It's the rest of the building is essentially a box, articulated with some windows that have triangular pediments. But this porch-like thing out the front is sort of like the side aisle for that church, in that it has these cubic boxes of space with a hemispherical vaulting over it, and the gray stone with the spandrels, with the circular spandrels inside, or circles within the spandrels, and in this case they're filled with sculpture, ceramic sculpture by Luca della Robbia. But to make this look, and when you think of it, it looks, now it looks relatively old-fashioned. To this sort of thing, it looks quaint and old, but at the time, for everybody in Florence, this was very new. This was they hadn't seen anything like this, and it's reminiscent of things that they knew to be Roman, but was new. Here's another look of it. Some paintings on the inside here, but most of them are white. Notice it has these little black lines right here. These are iron tie rods that are used to hold the building up, because the arches and the forces of these arches are not taken up by the wall and the column. There's thrust coming outwards that needs to be countered by the tension of these iron rods. And for some reason, the Italians didn't mind them. They thought they would make these beautiful arches. They like the semicircular arches, even though they have a lot of thrust. But it's okay to counter that with these things. The people in France, of course, with the Gothic architecture, when they introduced the pointed arch, was to counter that thrust. The whole business of what we think of as the characteristic of the cathedrals, the high loftiness and the pointed arches and the flying buttresses, all those were to compensate for the thrust and how the things would fall down otherwise. I don't know if they ever thought of putting iron rods and things to hold things up. But here, I think the Italians are more interested in how it looks, and how in having this look of the semicircular arches than they're worried about the thing standing up. They'll use this to help standing up. And we'll see later a painting with these bars in it, even though a painting doesn't need to have the bars in it. That's just part of their new world. So let's move on to sculpture and Donatello. Donatello was the major sculptor for the whole 1400s. He made many different commissions and was influential for the whole Renaissance and for the centuries beyond, for his characterizations of saints and things. But the image that we're going to look at is one of David, because there were several Davids done during the Renaissance, and they're instructive to compare one to another. This David is the first one, and it's made of bronze, and it's life-size. And it was, in fact, the first since antiquity of a full nude bronze sculpture ever made. They didn't make them in the Middle Ages, and you would have thought that the technology would have been lost, but they were able to resurrect it and make this. And when they were consciously making this as a thing that was like something that would be from the Roman Empire. Though, of course, in the Roman Empire, the figures were of standing male figures just standing. They represent maybe Apollo or a Kuros figure, or just an ideal figure, without having any story being told. But because this is during this had to have a Christian story, making David stand as if he were a classical statue is part of that spirit of the time, is to combine the new world of the Catholic world and the stories from the Bible with classical antiquity. So you have the figure standing in classical contrapposto. He has a face. We have a close-up of his face where he's modeled after the ideal classical face of the Greek face with a straight nose, and the proportions of the eyes. All these are recognizable as being from a sculpture. But it's not a full-grown man. It looks like a boy, and that's part of the story. Is that it's a boy rather than a grown-up idealized figure. It's also there's another angle here in that Florence itself saw itself as being like David in the story of David and Goliath, and that it was the underdog, being a city in a valley. It wasn't protected very much by one that would be on a hilltop with walls around it. It was vulnerable to attack, and many other places tried to attack it. There were people that, like the Milan, for example, had a much bigger army, and they were much more aggressive, and there were times when they tried to send armies to Florence to destroy it. And Florence, being smaller, and all they could do was just hire an army to defend themselves, felt that they were like David, and that and they were miraculously saved on at least 2 or 3 occasions from total destruction by what appeared to be divine intervention. That is, an army was on its way, and they caught the plague on the way, and they had to turn back, or some other intervention occurred that made it so that they didn't have to fight. And so, because of that, they saw themselves as David. So it was appropriate to make an image of David. And so, if you're going to make an image of David, how do you make it? First is that, because of the spirit of time, is to resurrect Roman and or classical antiquity, making it in the pose like a statue from classical antiquity is perfectly appropriate. But because Florence sees itself as weak in relationship to other places, and that they are only successful because of divine intervention, then the weakness of the David is consistent with how they feel about how vulnerable they are, and that how much they have to trust in God in order to continue their existence. So that's why he's like this. That's why he looks a rather effeminate version of David, rather than the different ones we will see later, where Florence becomes more self-confident, and that shows itself in the different Davids that we see later. But this one, if you look at the figure, the arms are like tubes. They're soft. There's hardly any definition in the muscles. He's wearing a kind of effeminate-looking hat. He has long hair. His body is all sort of like prepubescent looking. He's wearing these like he tried to put on some armor, but it wouldn't fit. And he's standing over the body, or the head of Goliath here. You can see Goliath's helmet, has a bird wing on the helmet. It's going up his leg like that, and in a graceful way. And all of these things are not things that have the heroic quality that a Greek statue would have, or a Roman statue would have. There's Goliath's head down there, and there's a laurel wreath, which is also a classical reference of victory down here. The sword looks way too big for him, and it looks like he could hardly even pick it up to cut off the head of Goliath to do that with. But all of this is again is to emphasize the miraculous aspect of the story. Just some years later, like 10 years later or something, when another commission for a David was made in Florence, and this time it was for an artist named Verrocchio, who had a large workshop in the middle of Florence, and it was a big workshop with many of the people in it became famous artists themselves, and so it was like the center of things. Leonardo himself was one of the apprentices there. And artists that we will see, Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Perugino, that we'll see in the painting side, all worked in Verrocchio's studio at one time or another. And also they created the Verrocchio's studio created the ball on top of the dome, and Leonardo was there for that. So this David, given the fact that the other one was already made and the artist knew about the other one, had to make a different one, and he had to surpass it in some way. And as we will see, the artists in the Renaissance competed with one another, and whenever anything new was made, the artists would look at it and evaluate it and see how they could surpass it. And they would whatever innovation that a previous artist had made, they would have to incorporate that into their own work and create some other new innovation. So this David is a little more cocky. He's a bit wirier, more definition in his muscles. He's a little older, a little more self-confident. He's he's not nude anymore. He's less like a classical statue and more like a naturalistic statue, in the sense that the face is no longer a classical face, but it looks like a portrait. In fact, it is a portrait of Leonardo himself, because Leonardo was this age when this was made, and at least people believe that he was the model for it. He's also wearing this sort of dress. It's like some sort of armor thing that is so form-fitting that it's as if it were you could see the musculature underneath, but it gives the sculptor an opportunity to make more stuff and to show off more sculpting skill. It was also gilt, so it was to be shinier and more impressive. These two are side by side in the same building in Florence now. So all of these things, the opportunity to put veins in the arms and more muscular definition, makes him look more. It makes him look stronger and more equal to the task of killing the giant. He doesn't need all the extra trappings of the laurel wreath and things. It's much more more direct, less symbolic, and removed from that ideal world. Though he still has the classical pose, and when I think of the classical pose, like the spear bearer or any of the Greek classical sculptures, they don't have this cockiness. They do have the engaged legs and the free leg and the contrapposto, the turn of the hips, the turn of the shoulders. All of this works exactly like classical sculpture, but this arm being akimbo like this is just says a lot more than the arm here. This is kind of a girly thing, and comparatively speaking. Here's another image of. You can see he looks a little more dangerous than the first one. And later, when we get to the High Renaissance, we'll see Michelangelo's version of David, which is altogether different. All right, so let's return to Ghiberti. These are his doors. The finished doors for the east side, the space between the baptistry and the front door of the church is called the Paradiso, and so these would be the gates of paradise. And when these were done, Michelangelo said that that they were worthy of the gates of paradise because they were so good. We're going to look at one of these panels as our representative panel, but you can see them all here, and uh, they're magnificent looking. They're made of bronze. They're covered with gold, and they've lost the quatrefoil pattern that the north and the south doors had, because that's too Gothic. Uh, but here the panels are larger and they're rectangular, and they have full scenes in them, and they will also include uh, one-point perspective from Brunelleschi. I guess Ghiberti wasn't above borrowing that, even though he beat out Brunelleschi. This is the image of one of the stories. This is Jacob and Esau, and it's the story is complex. It has several different scenes, but all of the scenes are made as though they existing in the same space. So the space is defined by Brunelleschian kind of architecture, having pilasters between two arches in a loggia, and an architrave up here. This is very much like something Brunelleschi would make, and it creates this open space, a sort of honeycomb sort of looking space, for these scenes to take place in and around, and on top of, here's another part of the scene up here, or one of the different parts of the stories that are occurring up here, and being a relief sculpture. The artist has the opportunity to show depth by having different depths of projection from the surface. I mean, you can think of this as the surface, and that's the farthest away thing. And as things get closer to you, they project from the surface a little bit more. And the ones that project the farthest, these figures, are almost independent of the surface. They're almost like 3D things that are stuck on top rather than projecting from the surface. Another thing he's doing is using perspective to organize the scene. These lines in the original description of how to do perspective by Alberti, who wrote the book on painting, came out in I believe the 1430s or so, was to first divide the front line into equal parts. A braccia is what he called it, which is like a foot and a half increments, and then pick a vanishing point out here, and then draw these orthogonals all the way from each one, and that organizes the space in terms of things that are moving away from you that are parallel to one another. They converge over here, similar to as if this were the place that Brunelleschi had it, the pole and the measuring stick, and using string to measure out the distances to things. So all this is a measured space, a rational space, and the line, the transversals that go this way, march back into space, each one getting progressively closer together, just like the ties on railroad tracks when you see them. And they have to be done in a measured way as well, in a measured way that is consistent with how fast they go. They get smaller as they go back, depends on how close you are to it. That is, a distance from here to some measuring point out here represents the distance your eye is towards you, from here to your eye. If that is the same, then the image that you see represents where everything in this picture would be if it were real and it was actually that far away from you, and where everything would intersect a plane in front of your face. This point, this intersection between this line and this line would intersect exactly at that point if your eye were at this point, at this distance, wherever this distance happens to be from it. And that's the logic of the system. And being a logical or rational space is something that not only sculptors but the painters are going to embrace as they, as the things that's the most contrasting aspect between them and the northern artists that we saw before, because the northern artists weren't concerned particularly about rational space. They sort of intuited whatever perspective they used. They didn't have any kind of geometric or mathematical system to organize their space. So First of all, let's look at these figures here. This is a group of female figures, and they're not really part of the story very much. They're just showing off. Ghiberti showing off his ability to represent figures. They look like classical kind of figures, like the kind you would see maybe on the in Roman sculptures, especially Roman relief sculptures, with lots of grace and swirls and you know drapery that's flying in the breeze, moving in all directions. This is the sort of thing that his competition panel had: the grace and the beauty and the classical proportions. The other parts of the story, this is Isaac, from the original story, who'd grown up in his old man, and he has a son Jacob, and Esau back here. We see that Jacob sells his birthright to, or Esau sells his birthright to Jacob in a scene after he'd been hunting, and so the different parts of the story are illustrated in different depths of carving. So there's a figure way back here in the distance, and it's very shallowly carved, whereas the ones a little closer to you are a little bit, they project a little more. The ones a little bit closer project a little more, and so on. So as to give that illusion that this relatively shallow image is going back in space. If you were using paint to do this, you would use light and dark and in positions and things and size changing to give that illusion. So let's look at another one. This is something on the door. This is a copy of one. The originals are in the museum, but the copies are not quite as sharp as the ones that are the originals. But you see that he's made use of the 1-point perspective and to organize his different pictures with lots of scenes. If we could look maybe back here, several of them have architectural things so as to have opportunities to do perspective. And on the doors themselves here, there's a example of the decorations on the side that are classical. This is a classical sort of acanthus ronceau looking thing in the shell thing. But the figures sticking their heads out, this one is Ghiberti himself. So that's that's a survey of the sculpture for the 1400s. We'll do sculpture for 1500s and beyond later. And next will be the paintings of the 1400s.